This story from The Intercept is an absolute bombshell. And in all seriousness, in a world that made sense, this should take down the Trump administration. So take a look. It's from The Intercept, like I said. A State Department team led by former Raytheon lobbyist pushed Mike Pompeo to support Yemen war because of arms sales. Supporting a war because of arms sales, which means because of profits. Okay, let's see what they say. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo faced internal opposition to U.S. support for the war in Yemen from State Department staff, according to a recent report. The staffers had become concerned by the rising civilian death toll in the war being carried out by Persian Gulf monarchies, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, not only owing to bombings of densely populated areas, but also a humanitarian crisis exacerbated by the fighting, with up to 8.4 million people at risk of starvation. Those concerns, however, were overruled after Pompeo discussed the matter with the State Department's Legislative Affairs team. The Legislative Affairs staff, according to the Wall Street Journal, argued that restricting U.S. support would endanger billions of dollars in future weapons sales, including a massive sale of precision-guided munitions between Raytheon, a U.S. weapons manufacturer, and Saudi Arabia and the UAE. That staff, the Legislative Affairs team at the State Department, is led by a former Raytheon lobbyist. Before his presidential appointment last June, Acting Assistant Secretary of State Charles Faulkner was paid handsomely by Raytheon to lobby lawmakers on defense procurement issues, ethics records show. This is the culmination of all of the corruption and legalized bribery that we discuss on this show on a regular basis. This is the logical ends to everything that we've spoken about to this point. You end up with just total and complete unethical and immoral decisions that quite literally back a genocide. And the reason that it's done, and it's laid out as clear as possible, clear terms here, is for profit. That's what's happening. So, do you see the problem with having money in politics? Do you see the problem with allowing corporations and the rich to buy politicians? Do you see the problem with the revolving door, where you have people from said corporations, in this case, the military-industrial complex, they go back and forth. Oh, I'm going to go into the public sector. When I'm in the public sector, I will do the bidding of those corporations that I used to work for. Okay, now I'm going back to the private sector, and I'm going to cash in, and they're going to pay me a couple $1,000,000 a year to do nothing. Okay, now I'll go back to the public sector, and when I'm there, I have to remember that my allegiance is not to the United States of America and to the American people to do what's best for the American people. My allegiance is to the people who are paying me a gargantuan sum of money, and that would be the military-industrial complex. So the whole point is, oh, I paid you off, so now when you're in the government, when the time comes, yes, you're going to have to say, oh, do you have humanitarian concerns about innocent civilians in Yemen? Well, I mean, if we address those concerns, that might cut into our profits. So what are we going to do? We're just going to sweep it under the rug and ignore it and act like this is business as usual. So they simply do not care. Guys, we've talked about Yemen in detail. Saudi Arabia, with U.S. weapons and U.S. backing and support, they're bombing mosques, they're bombing hospitals, they're bombing schools, they're bombing open-air markets. They're blockading the country and not allowing in food, not allowing in medicine. Some people are starving to death. There's a cholera epidemic there. People are dying from cholera, women and children. So we're supporting all that. What's happening is whenever anybody with a conscience spoke up in the government, they were overruled. And listen, they're laying it out. I'm just describing it in 4 or 5 different ways here, but you see the reality of the situation. They're laying it out for you. Wall Street Journal, The Intercept, they're the ones who are telling you that whenever people say, this looks like fucking genocide and we're aiding and abetting it, they go, oh, that's cute. But if we do anything to stop it, or if we, crack down on the UAE or Saudi Arabia, well, then we're threatening future profits. Now, I told you at the beginning, well, this is something that mainstream media talk about nonstop. Why wouldn't they be talking about this? Because they hire the people on purpose who would never know about or care about these kinds of stories, and they don't even understand why this is a big deal. Guys, Rand Paul once proposed a bill to stop arming Saudi Arabia. He went on CNN, and Wolf Blitzer asked him, what about the profits of the defense contractors? And Rand was stunned. He's like, what? And Wolf's like, yeah, what about, if we go down this path, what about the profits of the defense contractors? What about the jobs in the military-industrial complex and the defense industry? That's the mindset. The only reason why Wolf Blitzer is hired in that position is because he wouldn't connect the dots like I'm connecting them for you, and because he'd be like, what do you mean, business as usual? That's awesome, right? And this is where we are as a result of it. Mike Pompeo signed off, and arms are flowing more than ever to the Gulf countries. Donald Trump, by the way, another giant scandal. Donald Trump took over $300,000 from top Saudi officials at his hotel. Then he approved over a $300 billion weapons deal for them. So they didn't really spend over $300,000 at his hotel. But they paid him that much because it's a bribe. And then he goes, oh yeah, sure, I'll approve whatever you want. Oh, you want me to approve over $300 billion weapons deal? As I know, as a matter of fact, you're massacring civilians in Yemen? Think I give a shit about fucking dirt poor brown people in Yemen? I don't give a fuck. Because to them, they don't count as much as if something were to happen in fucking Connecticut. But at the same time, I say that's not even necessarily true, because Sandy Hook is in Connecticut. They got killed. Nobody did anything to try to change our laws to make it so that doesn't happen again. Or at least at the national level, nobody did. So they don't care, man. It's all about the money. It's all about the profit. It's all about business as usual. In this country, we have a warfare state. And this all harkens back to when President Eisenhower said on his way out, beware the military-industrial complex. Because when war becomes very profitable, you're going to have elected officials and you're going to have people in the government want more war. Because there's a small number of people, a small number of elites making a lot of money as a result of it. And that's what's happening here. To the point where even when people have a conscience and they're like, hold on now, look at what's happening here. Look at all the death and destruction. Look at all the civilian bodies that are piling up. I think I have a problem with this. Well, that's when the person who was a lobbyist at Raytheon, who's now in the government, is like, yeah, I'm overriding all that. We're going to keep going with business as usual, because what are we going to do? We can't jeopardize a weapons deal. We might not make as much money if we do that. Noam Chomsky has made the argument for a very long time that perhaps what the United States does, perhaps what we do, it's even worse than some of the worst murderous dictators throughout history. And his reasoning is, at least the murderous dictators, when they're involved in the slaughter of people, it's up front and it's to their face, and it's like, okay, I'm slaughtering you, another human being. Whereas when our actions result in the death of tens of thousands, if not millions, of civilians, including women and children, we remove ourselves from it, and we view it as like, you're just stepping on ants. So you don't even grant the people who you're massacring the humanity. You don't even say, oh, they are a human being and we are doing this. It's just like, no, it's like stepping on ants. They don't even reach the level of the concern of like an ant. And we remove ourselves from the process. So we feel as if, well, we're not doing it directly. So what is it? I mean, we're just making the money off of it and helping with the coordinates on the map to bomb and funding and propping up the regimes who are carrying it out. So in the case of Yemen, does it really count? No, I don't think it really counts. So there's that level of disconnected arrogance, which in Chomsky's mind, he says it makes us actually worse than some of the most brutal regimes in history. Because we don't even have the nerve and the honesty to tell ourselves the truth about what we're doing. It's disconnected, it's watered down, it's covered up, and there's a level of cowardice there that perhaps is even worse. So, I mean, it's one argument, it's one argument. You determine whether or not you agree with it. But what I'll say is, this level of corruption, this level of legalized bribery, it ends up superseding any and all concerns about human rights, about justice, about morality. And you cannot have a government function in a positive way, in the way that it's supposed to function. You cannot have a government function when it's awash in corporate money and billionaire money and military-industrial complex money and Wall Street money and big oil money. And that's the current state of our government. So we'll sit by and watch the climate get utterly obliterated because the incentives are in place for the government to not care because they're in bed with big oil. We just sit by and watch it happen. Sit by and watch women and children starve to death and die of cholera and die with our weapons, from our weapons. Because, hey, we're disconnected from it enough, and that's just status quo and business as usual, and what are you going to do? I mean, again, I'm struggling to try to put into words just how extreme this is. This is our government. Hey, we're massacring civilians here. We're responsible for the deaths of civilians. Well, former Raytheon lobbyist who's now in the government is overriding you and saying, the money is more important than those lives. That's not just amoral. That is immoral. This needs to be reversed. This needs to be covered extensively. I mean, this should lead to an outcry. This should be the number one scandal in news today. I'm not saying the thing with Kavanaugh and his fucking, sexual assault allegations. I'm not saying that shouldn't be covered. But what I am saying is, can we have a little bit of a sense of scale and priority here? But that's not going to happen. We're going to talk about that because there's a salacious angle to it. They're never going to talk about when it's tied into policy and when it's tied into the machinery of the system. This is baked into the cake of the system right here. This is par for the course. But what do you do in a situation where par for the course is genocidal? Par for the course is genocidal. Go ahead, see if they say that on mainstream media.